Hello and welcome to the Ren Den. I'm Ren, and today we're going to be talking about embroidery tools and accessories, things you might find useful, things that are essential, and then things that are kind of useless and maybe don't invest. A couple of caveats before we begin. One, there are lots of different ways to do embroidery, and something that I think is completely useless, and other people might be like, this is actually my essential thing and I can't do it without it. What are you talking about? There's no one right way to do embroidery, so let me know if the thing that I've discounted is actually your favourite thing. Second caveat is that I'm not going to be touching machine embroidery anything. I don't do it, so I wouldn't know, and in my mind, machine embroidery and hand embroidery are such different crafts that I wouldn't even know where to start, and that wouldn't be particularly useful to anyone, so not going there. So, with that out of the way, I hope this is useful to you. Let's get started. So I've just shuffled over so that I've got room to put the tier list here later, because this is the most boring bit of wall, so we'll cover that up with that. Tier system as follows. A grade, absolutely essential. Mechanically, you can't embroider without it. That's a fairly self-evident category, but we are going to talk about sort of variations in those things as well. B is going to cover things that you don't need. You can embroider without them, but they're not very expensive or hard to source, and they do make your life a lot easier, and I find myself using them all the time. C, I'm calling nice to have. Upgrades to the setup, but not something that you would feel necessarily the lack of if you didn't have. And D, I'm calling gimmicks. Things that seem like it's going to change your life, and actually it's useful once in a blue moon, or if you remember to use it, but really there are other ways to do that thing, and it's not really worth investing in. First on my list is needles. I'm going to call them an A grade. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. I think you'd struggle to embroider anything without some kind of needle. There are loads of different sizes, and people will say, oh, you should use this specific one for this specific task. If you're doing it all the time or professionally, that's probably true. If you're doing it casually or just for fun, I find myself only using two sizes of needles, like a big tapestry needle that's blunt. That's good for weaving things, or just kind of, having a bit of a fiddle without necessarily poking the fabric or getting caught on the thread. And then a tiny needle for the actual embroidery. I don't really find myself reaching for anything other than these two on a regular basis. So needles themselves, A grade, but don't worry if you haven't got exactly the right size or shape or brand. If it pierces the fabric and doesn't, if you're looking for a sewing needle, it needs to pierce the fabric and not make a giant hole. And if you're looking for a weaving stuff around itself tapestry needle, you want something bigger and blunter. Broadly, those are the two that I find myself reaching for. Next is embroidery thread. Now I'm going to call the category itself an A, because mechanically, again, you just need it to be able to embroider anything. People have opinions about whether to use like standard 6-strand embroidery floss or cotton pearl, and they all have different looks. And if you want to get into that, there is probably a lot of YouTube videos about comparing different kinds of threads. Broadly, you need thread. You just need something that is loosely the right thickness and the right colour, ideally, to get going. You don't need to worry about who's using the most high-end whatever. Number 3 is an embroidery hoop. Now, I've got loads of these, and I'm not really sure why. I think they must have been from when I was a kid or inherited or something. I've got loads of different sizes. It's broadly useful to have, like needles, a big one and a small one. I am going to call it, and this might be slightly controversial, I am going to call them a B grade tool, because yes, it makes it easier in a lot of situations to embroider, especially if you're doing things like French knots or even bullion knots, where the tension really, really does matter. You're going to find it useful. And I do, when I'm just embroidering a flat piece of fabric, I do generally put it in a hoop. However, for things like my Zelda jacket, which you might have seen, obviously that's got loads of seams in it, so it's no good to put in a hoop. Or you can do it, but it makes the tension funny, and so situationally, more often than not, you'd be using a hoop, and it would definitely make things a lot easier. But yeah, I'm going to call it a B grade because you don't actually need it to embroider. If you're confident enough in the way that you keep tension on fabric, you can just do it completely freehand all the time and it would be fine. Next is the fabric itself. Now, I'm going to call it an A grade. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. I think you need fabric because that's the thing that you're embroidering on. Having said that, there's people who do this sort of freestanding embroidery. I don't know how that works. I presume that you have to have some sort of fabric or something as a scaffold to embroider onto, and then you manipulate that thing. I don't know how that works. I haven't looked into it. It looks amazing. But broadly speaking, you do need fabric to embroider on. So I think that's fairly uncontroversially an A. Now, the next thing is sort of a subset of that, and it's Aida or Ida. It's basically a looser weave fabric that makes things like cross stitch a lot easier because the grid is very easy to see of the warp and weft of the fabric. I am going to call it a C because for me, it's not something I use very often. I appreciate that for some people, that's very much going to be an A or a B. But yeah, for me, I think it's not something you necessarily need when you start out. It would make it easier if you're doing particularly kind of geometric or gridded patterns, definitely. But it's not essential to the setup. The next thing on the list is a needle minder. Now, I only bought one of these recently. I have found it quite useful. I am, however, going to grade it a C because it's definitely in the nice to have category. It's an upgrade to the system of not having to, hold it in the fabric or risk misplacing your needle. But it's not fantastically secure. I would probably rather use a pin cushion if I was worried about, particularly because we've got cats. If they brush it past it in the wrong way, they'll ping the needle off into oblivion. So it's good for a temporary, just hold this while I need to do something. I functioned perfectly fine without it, and the minute it's annoying, it will go back in the cupboard. But for now, it's definitely a nice to have. And the one that I've got is Cute Little Fox. So I'm going to call that a C. Now, number 7 is pincushion. I use these a lot. It's where I store my needles. So there's always one in the kind of active project sewing box. And I have a couple of others kind of knocking around. I actually find it to be a much more secure way of holding a needle. It actively kind of covers the point, so I think it's safer if you've got kids or cats or any other kind of animals knocking around. So I'm actually going to put pincushion at a B because I think it's more broadly useful than a needle minder. You don't need one, but you need somewhere to put your needle, and a pincushion is as good as anything. Next on the list is a thimble. Now, I got a bit stuck with where to put thimble on the list because I very rarely use one unless I'm doing something particularly finicky and I do feel that it's causing kind of impact on any of my fingers. I find it much harder to embroider without being able to feel everything all of the time. And I appreciate that part of wearing a thimble is just getting used to it, but I've never really been able to kind of get past that initial barrier of I can't tell what I'm doing. I can't tell where the needle is. I've probably stabbed myself in a different place. Like, it's not consistent where I stab myself. So the thimble isn't going to help for that. And in terms of wear on my fingers, yeah, there are a couple of places where I get calluses more readily. And if I'm doing kind of a lot of embroidery in a short space of time, I will try and use a thimble for that. I prefer leather thimbles. Now, they're obviously not going to protect your skin as much as metal, but I find them much easier to use. I still have slightly a sense of where the needle is in comparison to the fabric and the thread, and I've actually cut the tops off a couple of leather thimbles and made kind of leather ring thimbles, which are medium okay, just so I can still got feeling in my fingertip, but I'm a little bit protected in that bit on my fingers where it feels like it gets particularly worn. So with all that, I think I'm going to put thimbles on a B because you don't need one mechanically. You can sew without it. And if you don't sew a lot, you might not find that you need it. And it's not even that they make the process easier necessarily. but they make it slightly more sustainable in the long term, particularly if you don't want your hands to catch on every piece of fabric that you pick up because you've calloused your thumb and forefinger. So yeah, I think thimble as a B makes sense to me. Then we come on to fabric glue, which I'm going to put at a D. Honestly, I think there probably are people who swear by it. I bought some because it seemed like everyone was finding it quite useful, and I haven't even got it out of the box. I think I much prefer to just either put a pin in to hold something in place, or put a couple of stitches in just to hold something in the right angle or whatever. That comes more naturally to me than fabric glue. And yeah, I just really haven't even thought about it except for doing this list since I bought it. So I'm going to put it at a D. The next thing is kind of a funny one. I've written pattern or guide. Obviously, that's not an essential thing. You can embroider from your mind, but I think it can be incredibly hard to do without an outline of some kind, even if you have made the guide or the pattern. And the reason I've put it like that rather than any kind of material is that you can use so many things to do that. I use this sort of wash away kind of paper fabric, and I print the design onto that with my printer. Or you can, in some cases, if the fabric is lighter and it's not going to see heavy wear between now and when you finish the embroidery, you can just use a pencil, literally a normal pencil. There's also tailor's chalk, which I find much less precise. That's better for like just cutting fabric out. But yeah, there are lots of different ways to do that. But I think I'm going to put patterns and guides in a B, just because you can do it without, but it makes it so much easier, and you'll see your shapes start to be so much more regular if you draw it out first and then follow that. On kind of the same topic, that I've put wash away guide paper as its own thing because I want to talk about specifically how that's probably the thing I use the most often. That's the most useful to me. I'm going to put it as a B because you don't need it mechanically. I think you can tell the sort of theme of like, A is like, mechanically you cannot embroider without this. B is you can, but I don't want to. But yeah, I use the wash away guide paper on almost everything, particularly the Zelda jacket, because you can't put it in a hoop, you can't draw on it because it's too dark. It just wipes away because it's too long. I spend too long over it, so by the time I come to the design it's already kind of rubbed off. I will say using the paper has been more successful since I started printing on it rather than just drawing on it. I find that the lines are clearer and stay clearer for longer. But I do think it's really worth, if you're doing designs and you're not following an existing pattern, I do think it's worth investing in some wash away sewing guide paper. So that's a B. Next on the list is needle cleaners and sharpeners. I think I'm going to put this at a D, which again, it will really depend on how you use your tools and how you embroider and what you find gives first. I find that I have worn the coating off a needle or even snapped it well before it's blunt or needs a clean. So for me, I have one of these technically because it's attached to a pincushion of mine. So they're little sort of bags filled with this kind of abrasive emery material, or sand they can be filled with. And basically you're supposed to be able to like put the needle in and it'll clean it and sharpen it and stuff. I have literally never used one, and it seems extraneous to how I embroider. So yeah, for me, that's a D. Next one is kind of a catch-all, a variety of embroidery stitches. I think this is somewhere between B and C, and I think it merits being between categories because it's in itself such a huge category. At some point I could maybe do a video about different embroidery stitches and like what are the actual basic ones that it would be useful to have in your wheelhouse from the beginning. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. But yeah, you can achieve a lot with a running stitch or a back stitch or whatever you pick up first. But at some point, you're going to want to start creating different textures, and having even 3 or 4 stitches in your wheelhouse will really help with that. So that level of it is a B. Anything sort of extra and funky and kind of sort of novelty or specialist, starts coming in at a C, because it really just depends on what project you're doing. Next is a bobbin winder. I have seen people talk about them not being very useful. I love my bobbin winder. When I decided to transfer all of my embroidery floss onto cardboard bobbins, which that's a thing we'll get onto in a second, the bobbin winder made it fun. Otherwise, I would have got more hand cramp, it would have been more boring. It was just a fun little thing. It is plastic, the one that I've got. It's hard to find non-plastic ones, and that is a drawback because I don't like having plastic tools particularly. And because it's only really useful when you get new thread, and how often do you need to buy new thread? That's a different question from how often you could buy new thread. But because you only really need it when something new has come into your collection and you want to transfer it into your kind of preferred system, I'm going to put it as a C, with the caveat that it was B bordering on A when I first got it, and could just transfer all of my thread so easily and so neatly. Relatedly, floss bobbins, particularly the cardboard ones. These do come in plastic, but I don't like just having things that are plastic when they could so easily be made of a more sustainable material. I'm going to put floss bobbins at a B. Again, you don't need them. I embroidered straight off of the skein for years. Now I look back at that and go, that was insane. You were constantly getting it tangled. What's that about? Having moved to floss bobbins, I would not go back. I will say you have to be careful about making sure that the thread that you transfer, you write on the bobbin what brand it is, what number it is, any details on the sort of skein packaging before you dispose of it, because otherwise you just have a bunch of colours, and at some point that's going to get annoying. But my thread all being on bobbins means that I can store it really neatly. I can see at a glance what I've got. It's so easy to, they're so kind of transportable, they don't get tangled. Depending on, you do have to be a little bit careful about the tension when you're putting it on to make sure that you're not stretching the thread. But again, if you're just like doing amateur or casual embroidery, it's really not gonna, I've never really noticed that matter. But yeah, floss bobbins I'm gonna put at a B because I love them. I would not go back. You don't need it, but it makes everything a hell of a lot easier. Next is embroidery scissors. The problem with embroidery scissors is that they're so cute. They're mini, they're often decorative, you can get them in beautiful shapes. A lot of the, if you look for like vintage embroidery scissors, they're gorgeous. And so you end up with 3 or 4 pairs for no reason. I'm going to put embroidery scissors at a C, which I know sounds kind of insane. Here's the thing. You need scissors of some sort, or some way to cut thread so that, you know, you can cut the bit you need to size and blah, blah, blah. Do you need embroidery scissors specifically? No. Are they cute and do they make it a lot easier? Yes. I do feel like I'm being a little bit harsh judging it a C rather than a B, but I'm going to stick by it purely because they're not the sort of vital component that I think a lot of people feel that they are. They are cute though. Next up is an embroidery stand. This is a new one for me. I just recently got an embroidery hoop stand. You can also get square frames, especially if you're doing larger pieces of embroidery or cross stitch or anything like that. You can get wider frames that you sort of stretch out, or crewel work I think also uses a square frame. But for just like embroidering in a hoop stand will do you fine. I love mine. You can see it being used beautifully in the background here. For me, it was a big upgrade. Because of the hoop, I can embroider for longer than I could if I was having to hold it myself, because you just don't get that sort of like weird posture hand cramp. I think the tension stays on the hoop a lot better because you're not handling it nearly as much. And it looks much more like an existing piece of art in the stand than it does if just the hoop is kind of lying about your house. The thing is, does it make the process easier? Yes, if you're doing something like French knots or bullion knots or anything like a weaving thing where actually it helps to have 2 hands that are completely free to just construct the stitch, yes, it makes it a lot easier. On a sort of everyday embroidery, would you feel the lack of it? Maybe not. I think looking at my category headings, I'm going to put it in a C. It is a nice to have. It is nice to have. but I don't think it quite moves up to actively making the process easier on a consistent enough basis to justify a B. I'm going to stick with it. Yeah, it's a C. Next up, needle threader. A. A needle threader is an A. It is an essential. You need it. Seems superfluous. Seems like, oh, it'll just make the process easier. But that's just the Puritan in your mind talking to you. Maybe it doesn't seem like a thing that you like out and out need. I'm telling you that you do. Especially if you're using the right size needle for the fabric, is often a very small needle with a very small eye. If you've got a needle threader, and it comes in, you can get ones that are hooks and ones that are loops and, you know, whatever one works. But if you have a needle threader, it just stops being a problem to get the thread on the needle every time. There's none of this like, oh, where's the light? Oh no, I've only got one strand through. There's none of that nonsense. You just thread the needle and then you move on to the actual fun part. Needle threaders are an A. Then we have a stitch ripper. Originally, I wasn't going to put this in because it's not specifically an embroidery tool necessarily, but I actually find it incredibly helpful if you want to undo something and redo it better. Stitch ripper. Yes, you can probably wangle some scissors under there and get it out that way, but the way to do it cleanly without affecting the rest of the work is a stitch ripper. That's what it's designed for. And actually, I've been using it more than I thought I would. Historically, don't go back and improve things that I've done. It's done, and if it's bad, then that was a lesson learned, and if it was good, then yay. But particularly for the Zelda jacket and something like that, where I am learning over a period of time, and I do want it to look good at the end, I have been unpicking and redoing when I feel like actually what is manifesting is not sparking joy and I do want to start again. So I am gonna put a stitch ripper at a B because you don't need it, but you kind of get stuck otherwise, not being able to sort of take something back and try it again. It just kind of takes the pressure off in terms of getting it right first time. And the final thing on my list is a work bag or a workbox or some sort of container for your project. I'm putting this at a B. Yeah, you could leave all your stuff loose and free. You don't have to do it. And especially if you're just doing like one thing on one thing and then moving on, you probably, you know, wedge your needle in your fabric to hold it there, put your thread in your pocket or whatever. And even just kind of like things that aren't work containers specifically, like a tote bag or whatever, sure, you could use. Finding the right container does really help. And it's not necessarily even in terms of like, I must find the perfect aesthetic box. Love a perfect aesthetic box. The workbox that I'm using is a see-through plastic thing that I got a bunch of embroidery thread sent to me as a secondhand thing in, and it's perfect. It's not cute at all, but it's perfect for the job. And it's got a clasp on it so that I can keep it safe from the cats. I can see through the lid so I know what I've got going on in there. It's small enough that it can't get too messy. I do have to sort of clear it out on a regular basis, so it's really a functioning space, but it's big enough that it can keep plenty of thread in it for if I've got 2 or 3 projects on the go at once, all of the bobbins can live in there. I think it really helps to just make picking up your embroidery easier. If I want to do some embroidery in front of the TV of an evening, I pick up the project in the box and then I leave the room. There's none of this, oh, and I'll need, and what thread was I working on, and what bag did I use last time, and losing things in tiny pockets, and get a little box or a little bag, whichever works for you. Think about the way that you use things. I'm not saying like everyone must have the perfect aesthetic container. I'm saying a container that suits you mechanically rather than aesthetically is really worth thinking about. So I'm putting it at a B, which I realise B is the most crowded category, but that's just the way it's going to go. And yeah, that's all I've got on my list. 20 things sorted. I think I stand by all of it, pretty much. There's a couple in there that I could be persuaded to shuffle, you know, here and there, but I think broadly it's sound. I would be interested to see what your opinions are, whether whether you agree with where I've put things. Like I said at the top, I know that people embroider differently. There's going to be people who are like, I can't live without fabric glue. I would die if I didn't have it. Fine. For you, it's an A or a B or whatever. For me, it's a D. Let me know if you think I've forgotten anything. I could do a follow-up if we can come up with enough other embroidery tools, but I feel like the fact that I didn't think about it in the first kind of go round maybe makes it not an A or a B. Sorry. Please do like and subscribe if you want to stick around, if you want to see more of this. Let me know if you have any other opinions in the comments, and feel free to check out my Instagram, Renden Crafts, where I post a lot of the sort of like ongoing projects, especially the longer term embroidery stuff there. So yeah, otherwise, take care, and I'll see you on the next project.